Like a lot of little boys, I absolutely idolized my dad. I wanted to be like him in every way. I wanted to look like him. I wanted to think like him. And I guess I wanted to smoke like him. In addition to that pipe, he went through 2 packs of cigarettes a day and the occasional cigar for good measure, all the while knowing that there was a rule he should have been following. Don't smoke. But there were always rationalizations that made him the exception. Yes, there's a rule, but I'm not convinced it's bad for me. I don't have a family history of cancer. I'm young and healthy. But I don't think this made him different from the rest of us. We all excuse ourselves from rules of one sort or another because we all kind of hate rules. After all, rules were made to be broken. Here's the problem. Rules can only work their magic if you follow them even when, especially when you don't want to. When you can come up with reasons to do something else because you're pulled in another direction by other desires or other considerations. After all, you know the line. How compelling or effective do you think they would have been if Moses had called them the 10 suggestions? Intrigued by the power of rules, my colleague Mumtaz Ahmed and I wondered if, like don't smoke and don't covet, there might be rules that apply in the world of business, too. We asked ourselves, what does it take for a company to make more money for longer than any other? We looked at 45 years of data on more than 25,000 companies, and we concluded that the key to exceptional performance without exceptional risk is following these rules. Rule number 1, better before cheaper. Companies are more successful for longer when they focus on higher performance and higher quality rather than pushing me-too offerings at lower prices. Rule number 2, revenue before cost. Profit is just revenue minus cost, and so all else equal, $1 more of revenue is worth the same as $1 less of cost. But all else is rarely equal, and it turns out that $1 more of revenue is worth more than $1 less of cost. Now, lots of other things can matter depending on circumstances, leadership, innovation, culture, but as far as we could tell, nothing makes a difference unless it is in the service of better and revenue. And so we concluded that those companies able to look at all of their other choices through the lens of these 2 rules were following our third and final rule: there are no other rules. When we explain these rules to managers, they are very often not particularly surprised. After all, the notion that you shouldn't compete on price and you can't cut your way to greatness, well, that's hardly new. But when we point out to these same managers that they could be doing a lot more to actually follow the rules, well, then their responses sound somewhat reminiscent of my father's rationalizations. Sure, there are rules, but my industry has been hopelessly commoditized. My customers are screaming for price cuts. I'm facing new lower-cost competitors from Asia. In other words, managers tend to see our rules more like suggestions. And so that's what's new about this work. Better before cheaper, revenue before cost, there are no others. These rise to the level of rules, and that means you should follow them not only when they appear to make sense, but even when, especially when, they don't. Let me give you an example of the cost of not following the rules. Maytag Corporation, the washing machine company, finished in the top 10% of all US corporations in 18 of the 26 years between 1966 and 1991. That is an amazing performance that goes far beyond what anyone could reasonably attribute to a run of good luck. How did Maytag get it so right? They followed the rules. Better before cheaper. According to the third-party evaluators, Maytag washing machines cleaned better, lasted longer, and required less maintenance than the competition's. Revenue before cost. For decades, the company sold through a network of more than 10,000 independent distributors that Maytag treated like family, giving them the incentives to invest heavily in convincing the buying public that Maytag quality was worth Maytag prices. Result? One of the longest runs of superior profitability in the modern history of the US public corporation. And then in the 1980s, along came big box retail. This new format reduced Maytag's army of independent distributors by more than 90% in little more than 5 years. They were also drawn to the lower-cost Asian manufacturers willing to provide a wide variety of products across a broad range of price points. I can see the consulting report. Maytag must broaden its product line, cut its costs in order to be more price competitive, and leverage its brand in order to secure distribution in the new channel. It makes perfect sense, and it's exactly what Maytag did. Except, the acquisitions required to fill out the product line undermined quality. Moving into more price-sensitive segments undermined the brand, and the new level of complexity left Maytag at an even greater cost disadvantage. Weaker brand, lower quality, higher cost. In 2006, Maytag disappeared as an independent company. How did Maytag get it so wrong? The company's choice was basically this: find new ways to be better in order to keep earning that price premium, or cut cost in order to cut price. In other words, Maytag had to decide if better really is before cheaper, and if revenue really is before cost. And that is not a straightforward exercise. Finding ways to be better in ways that drive revenue is a really messy problem. There are so many degrees of freedom and so many unknowns, it's often difficult just figuring out where to start. In contrast, how best to cut price and cost, while often ferociously complex, is an inherently tidy problem. Now, when you tackle a messy problem, you have to accept that you can't know what sort of an answer you're going to get. What you can count on is that whatever you unearth is going to look very different from the sort of response you get to a tidy problem. Instead of something comfortable and familiar, you'll come up with something unfamiliar, novel, even strange. Now, a messy problem with a strange solution means that your anticipated outcomes are going to look pretty dicey. But a tidy problem with a familiar solution, it's easy to believe that those outcomes will be highly reliable. Messy, strange, and dicey compared with tidy, familiar, and reliable. Is it any wonder Maytag made the choice it did? Is it any wonder most companies make the choices they do, saying that they're committed to better and revenue, but finding themselves focused on price and cost because that's where their analysis takes them? The irony, of course, is that better and revenue is the superior choice, leading to systematically more profitable outcomes at similar or even lower levels of risk. Unfortunately, most companies end up not seeing this because, thanks to the deep differences between these two paths, it almost never looks that way. And that's where rules come in. Rules overcome the limitations that prevent us from making the right choices. Rules counteract the bias introduced by nicotine addiction. Rules suppress our baser instincts and keep us on the path to virtue. Rules give us the courage to ignore the fog that obscures the true value of better and revenue and gives us the resolve to resist the sirens of price and cost cuts. Maytag shows us what can go wrong when you make the mistake of treating the rules like good ideas to be pursued when circumstances permit. Heartland Express, a trucking company, shows us the power of treating the rules like rules. Founded in 1955, the company had been profitable for decades when the industry was deregulated in 1979. That touched off a 15-year shakeout that bankrupted hundreds of trucking companies, but Heartland thrived. Its profitability fully 9 times the industry average, thanks to better in the form of superior service and revenue in the form of price premiums that ran to 10% or more. And then in the early 90s, a number of much larger trucking companies began closing in on Heartland. They gobbled up many of those smaller, struggling truckers and invested in assets and information technology in order to cut costs and increase efficiencies. Heartland's profitability fell by 1/3 and seemed destined for further decline. I can see this consulting report too. Heartland must cut costs through economies of scale and sustain its profitability by diversifying into logistics services. It makes perfect sense. And Heartland didn't do any of it. That's not to say Heartland didn't change. For most of its history, the company's particular brand of better had relied on owner-operator drivers, which meant that the company didn't have to own its own trucks. It had a point-to-point route structure, it focused on a fairly small geographic area, and had laser-like focus on a small number of customers. These seemed to be rules that governed many of the company's most important choices. But then, faced with these new challenges, Heartland ignored those seeming rules in order to follow the two that mattered. Heartland hired drivers and purchased fleets of new trucks. It built out a network of distribution centers and shifted to a hub-and-spoke route structure. It tripled in size through acquisition, increased its geographic footprint, and built out its book of business, all the while staying focused on profitable growth. These moves left Heartland at an even greater cost disadvantage, but allowed it to preserve its superior service, its higher prices, and its exceptional profitability. That's what it means to follow rule number 3. There are no others. Heartland changed just about everything about its business except its commitments to better before cheaper and revenue before cost. Heartland is not special just because it followed the rules. Heartland is special because it followed the rules even when, especially when, it wasn't obviously a good idea. Now, like every set of rules, there are exceptions, but our research is based on dozens of in-depth case studies like these and a systematic statistical analysis of the financial performance of every publicly traded company that has existed in the United States since 1966. And what I can tell you is that you can expect to do better for longer by following our rules than by not following our rules. And that's why you should follow the rules. Not only when you can build a business case in support of their merits, but even when, especially when, the numbers don't seem to add up. Now, I realize that won't come easily, but I have at least one reason for remaining hopeful. My dad quit smoking. He stopped thinking about it, he stopped making excuses, and he just followed the rule. And if a rule can give my dad the chance to play with his grandson Max, then maybe our rules will give you the confidence to make the right choices too. Because after all, rules were made to be followed.